She cooked the fish, the decorative fish, the one that had lived in the lobby of his penthouse for 3 years in a custom tank that cost more than most people's cars.
Daisy,
It's almost ready.
that was a koi fish.
It was also dinner.
It was a $3,000 decorative.
Kevin, it was just sitting there. You want some? You want some?
He closed his eyes. This was his life now. And somewhere underneath the anger, underneath all of it, was a girl with a wildflower behind her ear who had been trying to tell him something for weeks. He just wasn't listening. Stay with me, because what Kevin finds when she finally stops trying, that is the part that will change everything. Subscribe before we go any further. Let's get into it. Daisy Lane was 24 years old from Peach Creek, Georgia, where the summers lasted forever and the sweet tea was serious business, and people used everything that could be used and wasted nothing. And a fish in a tank was, practically speaking, just a fish in a tank. She had a plan before any of this happened: finish her agricultural sciences degree, go home, expand her grandfather's James Lane's farm into something that would outlast both of them, sit on the porch in the evenings, and be exactly where she was supposed to be. She had a plan until her grandfather called her into his kitchen on a Sunday afternoon with his hands shaking the specific way they shook when he was carrying something too heavy to hold alone. James Lane was 71 years old. He had raised Daisy after her parents died, fed her, schooled her, taught her to plant in hard ground and wait without flinching for things to grow. He had never, in her memory, asked her for a single thing. She said yes before he finished the sentence. The story of why began 50 years before Daisy was born. A young Kwon-soo Ryu, 22 years old and far from Seoul, on a business trip through the American South, found himself in trouble so serious that serious was not quite the right word. What matters is this: James Lane, a 19-year-old black man from Georgia with more courage than was probably wise, did something for Kwon-soo that could not be repaid in any currency that existed. Kwon-soo made a promise, not in writing, in the way men of that generation made promises that survived longer than documents, on his word, on his name, on the weight of a debt he carried until the day he could honor it. He honored it 50 years later. He called James Lane and said, "I have a grandson who needs a wife. You have a granddaughter. Let me take care of her the way I should have been taking care of your family all along." James Lane cried. He tried not to. He cried anyway. And Daisy said yes, not for the money, not for the penthouse, not for the heir of the Ruben group she had never met. She said yes because her grandfather's hands were shaking, and James Lane had never once asked her for anything, and she was not going to make him ask twice. What nobody at that kitchen table knew, what Kwon-soo Ryu had known for 16 years and kept with the care of something irreplaceable, was that the girl James Lane was sending to Seoul was not a stranger to his grandson at all. She was the girl Kevin had never forgotten. 16 years earlier, Kevin Ruben, age 10, visiting Georgia with his grandfather, a walk that went too far from the property, a creek that looked shallower than it was, and a small black girl of 8 years old with a wildflower tucked behind her ear who pulled him out of that water with a fierceness that made no sense for her size. He had given her the jade pendant off his own neck, his grandfather's before it was his, small, green, carved into the shape of a leaf, strung on a red cord worn smooth from years of handling, his most precious thing. He pressed it into her wet hand and said, "Keep this so I can find you when we're older." Then the adults arrived and he was rushed away before he learned her name, and the years passed, and Kevin Ruben carried the memory of a girl with a wildflower in her hair like something he had lost and never stopped searching for. Kwon-soo had recognized Daisy immediately from the photographs, from the description his 10-year-old grandson had given him 16 years ago, breathless and soaking. She had a flower in her hair, Haraboji, right behind her ear. I gave her my pendant. I'm going to find her. He arranged this marriage for the debt to James Lane, and for his grandson. He simply did not tell his grandson either of those things because Kwon-soo Ryu, at 76, had developed complete faith in the ability of people to find what they needed without being handed it. He would later revise this position considerably. Kevin Ruben agreed to the marriage because his grandfather asked him to, and because Kevin loved his grandfather with a completeness he did not show most people. He agreed. He was not enthusiastic. He had been told his bride was a young woman from rural Georgia, a farmer's granddaughter, and he had been fully prepared to manage the situation with efficiency and minimal disruption to his life. He had not been prepared for the koi fish. He had not been prepared for the morning he walked out of his bedroom at 7 a.m. to find every single light in the penthouse blazing, every window open, the smart TV playing 3 channels simultaneously, and the coffee machine making what appeared to be its 4th pot. Because Daisy had been experimenting with the buttons and had, in her words, just been seeing what everything did. You cannot just press buttons on a 40,000 won coffee system to see what they do. How else am I supposed to learn it? You read the manual. Kevin, I am not reading a manual for a coffee machine. It is not just a coffee machine, it is a... It made coffee, didn't it? She held up her mug. Want some? He looked at the 4 full pots of coffee on the counter. Daisy, how long have you been awake? Since 5. She looked at the window. Your floors are heated, by the way. I thought something was wrong with them all morning. He pressed both hands flat on the counter and breathed. This was week 1. Week 2 brought the laundry incident, his dress shirts on a clothesline she had constructed on the terrace using twine she had apparently brought from Georgia in her luggage, because of course she had. Week 2 also brought the afternoon he came home to find she had invited his entire security staff in for lunch because she had cooked enough food for 20 people and it seemed wasteful to let it go. Those are my security staff. They were hungry, Kevin. They are professionals. They eat on their own time. It was their lunchtime. They do not eat at my table. They ate at the kitchen counter, so technically... Daisy. The big one cried. I think he misses his mother's cooking. Kevin looked at his head of security, a man he had hired specifically for his ability to be unreadable in any situation, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with the expression of someone who had been caught doing something he could not explain. Park, Kevin said flatly. The jollof was exceptional, sir, Park said, and left. Kevin turned back to Daisy. She was already serving another bowl. He walked to his room, he closed the door, he stood in the silence of his perfectly ordered private space and thought very seriously about the choices that had led him here. Kevin, she appeared in his doorway 3 days later. Not now. It's important. Daisy, everything is important with you. The koi fish was important, the laundry was important,
Kevin, I need to tell you something about why we're actually... I know why we're here. My grandfather made an arrangement. I honored it. That's the end of it. It's not the end of it. There's something you need to know about... His phone rang. He looked at it, looked at her. I have to take this. Kevin! He took the call. He walked to the window. Daisy stood in the doorway of his bedroom looking at his back and thought about the number 2, because that was how many times she had tried so far, and she had come from a family of patient people, and she was going to try again. She was going to try a lot more times before this was over. Park Sena had been in Kevin's life for 3 years, not as his girlfriend, always almost that, positioned carefully in the space between close friendship and something more, that she had built deliberately and maintained with great patience. She was from one of Seoul's most established families, beautiful, composed, and she had decided long before the arrangement was announced that Kevin Ruben was going to be hers eventually. The arrangement had not been something she was prepared for. She arrived at the penthouse on a Tuesday afternoon. She was warmed to Daisy with the specific warmth that is more threatening than coldness. She sat in Daisy's living room like she owned the furniture. She touched Kevin's arm when she spoke to him and watched Daisy from across the room with the pleasantness of a woman who has already decided she is not a threat. Daisy was in the kitchen making preserves, actual preserves. She had gone to a market, bought fruit, sterilized jars using a method that involved Kevin's professional cookware in ways it was not designed for, and was now producing home-canned peach preserves in a 200 million won penthouse kitchen. "What is that smell?" Kevin said when he passed through. "Peaches. Why does my kitchen smell like peaches?" "Because I'm canning preserves, Kevin." He stopped. "Why?" "Because I like to. We have a fully stocked pantry. Not with my preserves, we don't." Senna appeared in the kitchen doorway. She looked at the jars, she looked at Daisy, and she smiled the smile of someone who has just found something useful. "How charming," Senna said. "How very homemade." Daisy looked at her. "You want a jar?" Daisy said pleasantly. "I made enough." Senna's smile stayed exactly where it was. "I'm watching my sugar." Daisy went back to her preserves. "Kevin, you want a jar?" "I do not want a jar, Daisy." "You'll want it later." She put one on the counter in front of him anyway. He looked at it. He did not throw it away. She noticed this. She noticed most things. Daisy had recognized Kevin the moment she saw him. Not the way you recognize a face, the way you recognize a moment you have been carrying for 16 years. He was taller, entirely rearranged by time, the 10-year-old boy from the creek rebuilt into this man who wore his irritation like a second suit. But she knew him. She had the pendant to prove it. She had worn it since that day, on its original red cord, tucked under her collar, never explained to anyone. The Korean boy with the serious eyes who had pressed his most precious thing into her wet hand like it was a promise. She had not expected the promise to spend most of his time being annoyed about fish. She tried to tell him on day 11. He had a call. Day 16, a meeting that apparently had been scheduled exactly for the moment she chose to speak. Day 20, she got furthest, all the way to, "Kevin, there's something about that creek in Georgia you need to," before Senna appeared from around the corner with a question about the weekend schedule that Kevin turned to answer immediately, and the moment was gone. She stood in the hallway and breathed. She tried 8 more times. He shut her down every single one. The phone, the meeting, the walking away, the voice he used when he wanted conversations to be finished. Once, memorably, she had tried during breakfast. She had sat across from him at the marble table and said, "Kevin, I need 5 minutes to tell you something, and it matters." And he had looked at her over his coffee and said, "Daisy, this morning the robot vacuum tried to eat your slippers, which were in the middle of the floor, and I need 5 minutes to not hear anything from you." And she had looked at him and said, "I told you those shoes go by the door," and he had put his coffee down and left the room. She had sat alone at the marble table and laughed, a real laugh, the kind that arrived before she could decide about it, and then caught herself and stopped. He was not going to listen. She needed to accept that. She was almost at that acceptance. What Daisy had noticed, in the careful way she noticed everything, was that Kevin Ruben was not a bad man. He was an annoyed man. He was an absent man. He was a man who had decided what everything was before he examined it and saw no reason to revise his conclusions. But she had caught him twice. Once in the kitchen doorway at 6 a.m., when he thought she had not seen him, he had stood there for 40 seconds watching her cook before he cleared his throat and complained about the noise. She had been in the middle of singing something low to herself, the way she did when she was cooking, and his face in those 40 seconds before he composed it had been doing something she could not read but could not forget. Once in the hallway, when she had been on the phone with Tamara, laughing loudly about something from home, and she had turned and found him standing 10 feet away with an expression that was gone the instant she looked at him. She thought about those 2 moments more than she intended to. She also thought about the first night in this penthouse, when the jade pendant had slipped from her bag and she had picked it up and held it, and thought, he is right down that hall and he has absolutely no idea. The incident with the washing machine happened in week 4. It was not entirely her fault. The machine had 14 settings displayed in Korean, and one button that she had been fairly confident was the right one, which had actually activated the industrial drum cleaning cycle, which had, over the course of 40 minutes, produced a sound Kevin later described as what he imagined the inside of a car accident felt like, and a laundry room full of foam that reached the doorframe. He came home to foam. Actual foam, in his hallway. Daisy was standing in the middle of it in rain boots she had brought from Georgia. She had brought rain boots from Georgia, with a mop that was not achieving very much. Kevin stood at the edge of the foam. He looked at it for a long time. Daisy, the machine is confusing. It has 1 button for each setting. There are 14 settings, Kevin. You only needed 1. How was I supposed to know which? The pictures on the buttons. They are pictures. I thought that one was a flower. It is a drum for the drum cycle. Well, it looks like a flower. He turned around. He walked to his room. He closed the door. From behind the door, Daisy heard what she was almost completely certain was Kevin Ruben counting to 10 in Korean. She went back to mopping. She also found it was easier in the rain boots. Sina came more frequently as the weeks passed. She was warm. She was patient. She was positioned in every room she entered with the ease of someone who had been practicing for a long time. She brought things: coffee from Kevin's preferred place, documents he had mentioned needing, information about events she knew he cared about. She made herself useful in the specific way of someone who understands that usefulness is the most durable form of presence. She also watched Daisy. She watched the way Daisy moved through the penthouse without apology. Boots on the marble, preserves in the professional kitchen, wildflower behind her ear, regardless of what the day required. She watched the way the staff behaved differently when Daisy was in a room. The extra warmth, the small, unnecessary conversations, the way Park, the security chief, had started appearing in the kitchen corridor slightly more often than his duties required. She watched the way Kevin's jaw tightened sometimes when Daisy laughed unexpectedly loudly from another room. Not with irritation, with something else, something he caught himself doing and closed back down immediately. Sina stored all of this carefully. Then, one afternoon, she found Daisy alone on the terrace. Daisy had planted tomatoes in the corner planter, actual tomato plants in a designer planter that had previously held an orchid that cost 400,000 won, and she tended them every afternoon with complete dedication. And Sina sat beside her with the pleasantness of someone who has decided to be direct. "You know this isn't going to work," Sina said, gently, almost kindly. Daisy checked her tomatoes. "He needs someone who fits his world, someone who understands what he does, who he is, what his family expects. You are—" a small pause. "You are very warm, but warm is not what this life requires." Daisy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long have you been waiting for him?" Sina's pleasantness adjusted by 1 degree. 3 years, Daisy said, not meanly, just placing it where it was. "And he hasn't moved in 3 years." She looked at her tomatoes. "That's not a him problem or a me problem." She stood, brushed her hands on her jeans. "You want some tea? I made a pitcher." Sina looked at her. "No," Sina said. "Okay." Daisy went inside. Sina sat on the terrace alone and felt, for the first time since she arrived, something she did not have a graceful name for. The last attempt happened on a Thursday evening. Sina was there,
Kevin was across from her on the sofa going through documents. Daisy came out of the kitchen, stood in the doorway, and said, "Kevin, I need to tell you something. Tonight. Right now." He looked up. Something in her voice was different. He heard it. She could tell he heard it because he set the document down, which he never did. "Daisy, 5 minutes. That's all I need. 5 minutes, and then you'll understand everything." He opened his mouth. Sina's phone rang. Sina looked at it, looked at Kevin, made the small apologetic gesture of someone who has nothing to do with the timing. Kevin turned toward her automatically. "Take it." And that was it. Daisy stood in the doorway. She looked at him, turned toward Sina. She looked at the space where his attention had been for exactly 3 seconds before it moved. She nodded once, to herself, not to either of them. She went to her room. She called Tamara. "I'm done trying," she said. Tamara was quiet for 1 second. "Come home." "Not yet," Daisy said, "but I'm done." She packed the way she had packed when she moved into her grandfather's house after her parents died. Quickly, cleanly, without ceremony. She had a contact in Seoul through the agricultural research network she had quietly been building for 8 weeks, while Kevin was busy not noticing what she was doing with her days. She had a small apartment lined up within the hour. She stood in the center of her room. She reached under her collar and unclasped the red cord. She held the jade pendant in her palm and looked at it for a long moment. 16 years she had carried it. It was warm from being against her skin. She set it on the nightstand. She picked up her bags. She walked past the living room where Kevin was now alone on the sofa, Sina gone, reading his documents. He looked up when she passed. "Where are you going?" "Out." She kept walking. "With bags?" "Daisy." She stopped. She turned. She looked at him sitting on that sofa in that penthouse with his documents and his perfect life that had been so thoroughly unbothered by her presence that she had never once broken through the surface of it.
"I tried to tell you something 44 times," she said. "You didn't have time for any of them." She picked up her bag. "So I'm going to go find somewhere that has time for me." She left. He heard the elevator. He sat on the sofa for a moment. Then he went back to his documents. He would think about that later. He did not know that later was going to arrive faster than he was ready for. He noticed at 6 the next morning. He came into the kitchen and it was wrong in a way he could not name for 3 seconds, and then he named it. Quiet. No 5 a.m. sounds, no smell of something that shouldn't be possible but somehow always was. The particular presence that had occupied this penthouse for 8 weeks, irritating, loud, completely unbothered, undeniably alive, was gone. He went to her room. Door open, empty, bed made with the precision of someone who had not left in anger, who had left carefully, which was somehow the worst version, and on the nightstand, a jade pendant on a worn red cord. Kevin picked it up. He went very still. He had not seen this object in 16 years, had not held it in 16 years, but he knew the weight of it in his palm before his mind caught up with what his hand was telling him. The specific worn smoothness of the cord, the exact shape of the carved leaf. He sat down on the edge of the empty bed, and then the images came. Daisy on day 3 with a wildflower tucked behind her ear. He had seen it and filed it somewhere he had not examined. Daisy who knew things about this city in her first week that took most people months. Daisy saying it's been 16 years and it's been waiting long enough in a corridor he had been walking away through. Daisy at the kitchen table, looking at him with something in her eyes he had never named because he had never stopped long enough to look. "Kevin, I need to tell you something about that creek in Georgia." He pressed his hand over his mouth. He sat there for a long time. Then he called his grandfather. Kwan Su answered on the first ring. "You knew," Kevin said.
A pause, the specific pause of a man who has been waiting for a call for 8 weeks. Yes, his grandfather said. You knew she was the girl. Yes. And you didn't tell me. No. Why? His grandfather was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice had the particular gentleness of someone saying the truest thing they know. Go find her, he said, and this time, listen. He found where she was through Park, who had, it turned out, known her address since day 2, because Daisy had given it to him herself before she left, saying, in case Kevin actually needs something, which was the most Daisy thing Kevin had ever heard in his life, and he felt the weight of it in his chest the whole drive over. He showed up at the door of her small apartment on a Saturday morning. She opened the door and looked at him. Then at his hand. He was holding the pendant on its red cord. You found it, she said. You left it.
I did. Why? She leaned against the doorframe with the steadiness of a woman who had stopped managing how she was received. Because I was tired of carrying something that was yours, she said, and because if you were ever going to find what I had been trying to tell you, you were going to have to do it without me standing in the room, making it easy. He looked at her, at the wildflower behind her ear, at the woman his 10-year-old self had given his most precious thing to, with the absolute certainty of a child who understands important things before he has words for them. You pulled me out of that creek, he said. You were going under, she said. I wasn't going to watch that. You were 8 years old. I was big for my age. He almost smiled. It arrived before he could stop it, and something in her expression shifted at the edges in response. I have been looking for you, he said, since that day. I didn't know your name. I only knew the wildflower. Yes. She looked at him. You could have listened, she said. Not cruelty, just the truth, placed exactly where it needed to go. I tried 44 times, Kevin. I know. You were too busy being annoyed about the fish. The fish was $3,000, Daisy. It was delicious, though. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression, the specific undoing of a man who has been holding a position that has stopped making sense. I want to start again, he said. Not the arrangement, not the contract. I want to... He paused. I would like to actually know you. I would like to be someone worth knowing in return. She was quiet. That's going to take time, she said. I know. And work. I know. You're going to have to stop leaving rooms in the middle of my sentences. Yes. And apologize to the fish. I am not apologizing to a... Kevin. He exhaled. Fine, he said. She looked at him, standing in her doorway, holding a 16-year-old pendant on a worn red cord with the expression of a man who had finally arrived somewhere after a very long time of moving in the wrong direction. Come in, she said. I'll make breakfast. Please not fish, he said. I was going to make biscuits. What kind? Georgia biscuits. He stepped inside. And that was the beginning of something that was going to be considerably louder before it got quiet, because Kevin Ruben, once he started paying attention, was thorough about it. He showed up at the Agricultural Research Center where Daisy had enrolled in a part-time research collaboration, which he had not known about because he had spent 8 weeks not knowing what she did with her days, with coffee made to a temperature Tamara had provided him after a phone call he was not proud of. He sat in the back of a community lecture she was presenting on sustainable urban farming and was overheard by the person beside him saying, absolutely unprompted, that she was the most genuinely capable person he had watched work, and he had watched a lot of people work. He called James Lane. He introduced himself and said, Sir,
I owe your granddaughter an apology, and I would like to start by telling you that she is extraordinary, and I was too certain about what I already knew to see that for 8 weeks, and I intend to spend considerably longer than 8 weeks fixing that, if she allows me to." James Lane was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Son, I knew your grandfather for 50 years. I know what it looks like when a man has figured out what matters. Keep going." Kevin kept going. He learned to be awake before 7. It was not graceful. He arrived in the kitchen on day 3 of trying, at 5:50, looking like a man who had survived something significant, and Daisy looked at him and said, "You look terrible," and he said, "Thank you," and she put a plate in front of him without another word, and he sat there in the 5 a.m. quiet of the kitchen that had always been hers, and ate and said nothing, and it was the best meal he had eaten in 8 weeks, and he had been eating her cooking for 8 weeks.
He stopped being where Sina was. Sina understood. She was too perceptive not to understand. She left with the composed dignity of someone who loses well, which is the most sophisticated kind of losing. The public moment happened on a day Daisy had not planned for, and Kevin had prepared with the thoroughness he applied to everything he decided mattered. There was a small ceremony at the Seoul Agricultural Institute, an award for community research Daisy had been nominated for by the faculty she had worked with during her 8 weeks of being a person Kevin had failed to notice. She had not told him about it. She was still learning what to tell him. She was standing at the front of a room of 50 people receiving an award for work that had nothing to do with Kevin Ruben or his penthouse or his grandfather's arrangement, and everything to do with who she had always been, and she was in the middle of her acceptance speech when Kevin stood up from the 3rd row. She stopped speaking. The room looked at him. He looked at her. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, and he meant it, which he did. "I'll be quick." The room was completely still. "I have been looking for the woman standing at that podium since I was 10 years old," he said. "I found her 8 weeks ago, and I spent those 8 weeks being so certain I already knew what she was that I missed every single thing she actually is." He paused. "She tried to tell me 44 times. I didn't listen once." Another pause. "I am telling everyone in this room, because she deserves witnesses, that I see her. I see exactly who she is, and I am asking her publicly to let me spend considerably longer than 8 weeks being someone worth seeing in return." The room did not breathe. Daisy looked at him for a long moment. The wildflower was behind her ear. The award was in her hand. "You are interrupting my speech," she said. "I know. In front of 50 people. Yes. Kevin. Yes." She looked at him, this man who had found a pendant on a nightstand and driven to her door, and learned to wake before 7 and called her grandfather, and was now standing in a room full of strangers saying something he completely meant with the specific expression of a man who has stopped managing how he is received. She looked back at her audience. "I'll be with you in 1 moment," she said pleasantly. She stepped down from the podium. She walked to the 3rd row. She stood in front of him, and she reached into her collar where the jade pendant sat. She had put it back on at the apartment the morning he came, and she held it between them in her palm. "You gave me this," she said quietly, "when we were 10 and 8, and you said keep it so I can find you when we're older. Yes, you found me. I did. Took me 8 weeks longer than it should have. It took you 16 years and a koi fish," she said. Something completely broke open on his face. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she said, "Don't interrupt my speeches," and she went back to the podium, and Kevin sat back down in the 3rd row, and the entire room turned to look at him, and he sat there looking at the woman finishing her speech at the front of it, with the expression of a man who has finally, completely, irreversibly looked.
and in the back row where nobody had noticed him because Kwon-soo Ryu had been placing himself in rooms without being noticed for 76 years, Kevin's grandfather pressed his hand over his mouth and let himself feel the quiet, specific satisfaction of a man whose faith in people had finally completely been vindicated. Next to him, also in the back row, Park the security chief sat with his arms folded and the expression of a man watching something he had been waiting for since the jollof rice. Some things take exactly as long as they need to.
Kevin stopped leaving rooms before she finished her sentences. The tomatoes on the terrace grew, and James Lane, sitting on his porch in Peach Creek, Georgia, received a photograph from his granddaughter of Seoul in the early morning, the city lit up and vast and entirely hers, and sat with it for a long time. Then he put it on the refrigerator next to the one of her at 8 years old, with a wildflower tucked behind her ear. Some promises, he thought, just need the right amount of time and the right amount of fish. If this story got you, tell me in the comments. Was it the koi fish? Was it Kevin on the phone with his grandfather? You complained about the fish. Was it Daisy setting the pendant on the nightstand before she walked out? Was it him standing up in that room? Or was it Grandpa, Kwon-soo, and Park in the back row? Drop your moment below. I read every single one. Subscribe if you are not here yet. Every week there is a story worth feeling, and this one has a sister story coming that you do not want to miss. Catch you in the next one.